At the dawn of the 20th century, China was still an empire, but only in name. The map told a different story. Foreign flags flew over key cities. In Shanghai, British and French enclaves ruled over entire districts. Shandong belonged to the Germans. Manchuria saw Russian troops patrol its rail lines. From Canton, Guangzhou to Tianjin, treaty ports replaced Chinese law with foreign rule. Internally, the empire was cracking. In Beijing, the Qing court, led by Empress Dowager Tixi, spent naval funds on marble palaces, while famine spread across Henan and Anhui. Missionary tensions erupted in Shaanxi, while the Silk Road trade collapsed in the west. Beneath the surface, revolution brewed. From Tokyo to San Francisco, Sun Yat-sen and his underground network plotted the dynasty's fall. Foreign railways slicing through Sichuan and Hubei became flashpoints for protests. Warlords gathered power across the provinces, waiting for the empire to fall. And in 1911, it did. A protest over railway control in Sichuan triggered a mutiny in Wuchang, and the Qing Dynasty, weakened by 12 crushing forces, finally collapsed. This is the story of how an empire fell, one port, one province, one betrayal at a time.
Once, the Qing Dynasty rode into China from the northern steppes. Manchu warriors draped in silk and steel, sweeping away the last Ming emperor. They ruled with force, cunning, and a belief in their divine right. But by the mid-1800s, the fire had dimmed. The emperors of this once mighty empire no longer led charges on horseback. Instead, they sat behind carved screens, issuing decrees. Few followed. The Chinese Empire was conquered by about 120,000 Manchus. They had the strengths of discipline, unity, military readiness, and brilliant strategy. But the decline of the Ming dynasty was just as important to their success. The Ming's glory had diminished to near collapse in the space of a few decades. And at the beginning of the 17th century, the dynasty faced threats from barbarians on all sides, political infighting, rebellion throughout the country, and low levels of morale and loyalty in the military. Foreign ships docked at Chinese harbors, their flags flying boldly, their demands sharper than swords. Diplomats from Britain, France, Russia, and Japan did not kneel at the Dragon Throne. Instead, they made demands, and the Qing court, racked by factionalism and fear, gave in. Behind the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City, the imperial court turned inward. Paralyzed by ritual, whispers, and superstition, the emperors clung to ancient ceremony while the world around them changed faster than ever. Outside, the people suffered. Rebellions flared. Famines raged. Silver drained from the treasury like blood from a wound. And yet the court remained in denial. Foreigners, emboldened by Qing weakness, divided China into spheres of influence. As if it were a map to be shared, not a nation to be respected. It was during this time that the world began to whisper a new name for the empire once feared and revered: the sick man of Asia. Not because of disease, but because of something worse: stagnation, submission, and slow decay from within. In the early 19th century, China held treasures the world craved: tea, porcelain, silk. The British drank Chinese tea by the ton, but had little the Chinese wanted in return. Only silver. And that silver? It was draining fast. To stop the bleed, the British found a darker solution: opium. Grown in the poppy fields of British India, the drug was smuggled into southern China, hidden in tea chests, stashed in secret compartments. The trade exploded. Soon, entire communities fell under its spell. Addicts roamed the streets. Families sold heirlooms for another pipe. China's silver reserves evaporated, not to trade, but to feed a nation's growing addiction. Finally, the Qing government acted. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu arrived in Canton with orders to end the trade. He seized opium warehouses, dumped millions of pounds of the drug into the sea, and wrote a scathing letter to Queen Victoria. The British responded, not with words, but with gunboats. The First Opium War began. China's wooden ships and outdated muskets were no match for British firepower. The war ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. China ceded Hong Kong, opened 5 ports, and paid millions in silver. Humiliated, the Qing limped on. But the addiction didn't end, nor did the trade. A second war broke out in 1856. Fought over insult, access, and the right to keep the drug flowing. The result? Another defeat. This time, the emperor was forced to legalize opium, the very poison destroying his people. It was more than a war for trade. It was a war for China's soul. And as the smoke curled upward, the seeds of rebellion, resentment, and revolution sank deeper into Chinese soil. It began in silence. Whispers carried on the wind. In the year 1900, a strange and desperate movement rose from the parched heart of northern China. They were not soldiers, not trained warriors. They were farmers, blacksmiths, monks, and laborers. Men who had watched droughts destroy their crops, seen foreign railways slice through sacred land, and knelt as missionaries condemned their gods. They called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, but the world would remember them as the Boxers. Fueled by superstition, desperation, and rage, the Boxers believed they could make themselves bulletproof through ritual and faith. Their enemy? Foreigners, Christians, missionaries, and the Qing government that had failed to protect the soul of China. The violence spread like wildfire. Foreign priests were slaughtered. Chinese converts were dragged from their homes. By summer, the Boxers had marched on Beijing, surrounding the foreign legation quarter, where diplomats, soldiers, and their families huddled behind makeshift barricades. For 55 days, the siege held. Gunfire rang through alleyways. Food ran low. Desperate telegrams pleaded for help. Help came, but at a price. 8 nations formed an alliance. 20,000 foreign troops stormed into China, carving a bloody path to the capital. Villages suspected of aiding the Boxers were burned to the ground. Thousands were executed without trial. Looting, rape, and pillaging followed. Beijing was occupied. The imperial court fled west. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had once backed the Boxers in secret, now begged for mercy. When the dust settled, the Boxer Protocol was signed. China was forced to pay over $300 million in silver in reparations, an impossible debt. Foreign troops remained. More land, more rights, more humiliation. The BoxerRebellion did not save China, but it showed the world and the Chinese people just how deeply broken the empire had become. By the late 19th century, the ports of China no longer belonged to China. In Shanghai, down along the Bund, the sign said it all. No Chinese allowed. It wasn't just a city. It was a stage set for humiliation. Grand European-style buildings loomed over muddy Chinese streets. British officers sipped tea in clubs where local Chinese couldn't even step foot. How had it come to this? The answer lay in a series of defeats. Wars fought and lost. Treaties signed under threat. In exchange for peace, the Qing government had handed over chunks of its own cities to foreign powers. These treaty ports, Shanghai, Tianjin, Canton, became extraterritorial zones where Chinese law held no sway. Foreign gunboats lined the docks, and Chinese police had no authority inside. The heart of China's coastal cities beat to a Western rhythm, and each new foreign concession was a bruise on the empire's pride. But not all bowed to the humiliation. Far from the grandeur of the Forbidden City or the foreign clubs of Shanghai, a young man was plotting the end of the old world. Sun Yat-sen, a doctor educated in Hawaii and Hong Kong, saw clearly what others could not, or dared not, say aloud. The empire was beyond saving. It had to fall. Sun traveled like a ghost through the shadows of empire. In Tokyo, Singapore, Paris, and San Francisco, he met with exiles, students, and secret societies. They exchanged codes and pamphlets, money and ideas. One day, Sun promised the Dragon Throne would fall, not to invaders, but to the people themselves. He wasn't famous yet. He wasn't even welcome in many countries. But his revolution had already begun, whispered in tea houses and plotted in basement rooms. Even the ground beneath China's feet wasn't entirely hers. In the name of progress, foreign powers offered loans to build railways, but the deals were poison-tipped. The contracts handed control of vast infrastructure to foreign investors. British engineers laid tracks through rice fields in the south. German companies cut through mountains in the north. French and Japanese firms staked their claims next. To many, these railways weren't veins of modernity. They were chains. The tracks connected not cities, but control. Wherever they went, foreign troops followed, and Chinese workers toiled under foreign overseers. And when the government tried to reclaim those lines, to nationalize the railways and fund it with local taxes, it sparked outrage. This would not be forgotten. Inside the imperial court, however, the storm outside barely registered. The woman behind the curtain, Empress Dowager Cixi, still ruled with icy control. When funds were allocated to modernize the navy, she diverted them to her own personal pleasure. A marble boat in her summer palace, a symbol of opulence that literally could not sail. Outside the palace walls, famine spread. Villages starved, bandits multiplied. But within her palace, concubines danced, eunuchs whispered, and the marble boat floated silently on the lake, glistening in the sun like an insult. Christian missionaries had come to China preaching salvation, but many Chinese saw only arrogance and disruption. They opened schools, hospitals, and churches, but also condemned local traditions and aligned themselves with foreign powers. Some converted, many resisted. Tensions simmered, especially in the countryside, where locals feared their gods were being displaced. In 1895, those fears turned to fury. Angry mobs rose up across several provinces. Nearly 200 missionaries and their families were killed, burned, stoned, hacked to pieces in riots that shocked the West. China's resentment was now violent and visible. With each shock, the Qing court became less relevant. Out in the provinces, military governors were no longer waiting for orders from the emperor. Many weren't even pretending. They had armies, taxes, loyalty. Some still claimed to serve the Qing, others already acted like kings. They were the warlords in waiting, each watching the others, each calculating the right moment to strike or defect. They weren't idealists like Sun Yat-sen. They were opportunists, and they were patient. In the West, ancient cities once bloomed along the old Silk Road, Lanzhou, Kashgar, Dunhuang. But the camel caravans had stopped coming. Trade now moved by steamship and rail. What had once been China's global lifeline had become a ghost trail through the desert. Markets faded. Craftsmen left. Whole towns emptied. The world had changed its rhythm. China was still clinging. Even hair had become political. For over 250 years, Han Chinese men had been forced to wear the queue, a long braid down the back with the front of the head shaved, imposed by the Manchu Qing as a symbol of submission. But by the early 1900s, to cut the queue was to declare rebellion. It meant you were done bowing to emperors. Barbershops became battlegrounds. Young men snuck out at night to shear their braids and hide them, trembling in fear and pride. What began as fashion became revolution. The clock finally struck in 1911. The trigger? The Qing government's move to nationalize railways, seen as yet another betrayal, another favor to foreign banks. Furious protests erupted in Sichuan. Troops were sent to suppress them. But in Wuchang, the soldiers themselves mutinied. The fire caught. Province after province declared independence. Within weeks, the dynasty was finished. The last emperor, a child, was forced to abdicate. The Dragon Throne, which had stood for 2 millennia, fell silent. And so ended the Celestial Empire. Not with one war or one man, but under the slow pressure of 12 great forces. 12 wounds, each bleeding sovereignty, pride, and order. But from this collapse, a new China would begin to stir.